On the morning of April 17th, 2004, Gerald Voss drove 11 miles from his farm to Meridian Implement in Bloomfield, Iowa, with a hydraulic pump in a cardboard box on the passenger seat and a manila folder of service records on top of it. He had been up since 5, not because of the drive, which would take 20 minutes, and not because of any particular anxiety about what was ahead, though there was some of that too. He was up at 5 because he was always up at 5, because the farm required it, because the work began when the light began, and sometimes before it, because that was the life he had chosen at 28 years old, and had lived without regret for 25 years since. He made coffee the way he always made it. Dark too much of it in the percolator Nora had been trying to replace for 3 years. He drank the first cup at the kitchen table while the farm outside the window came up gray and then slowly gold in the early light. The fields were his. 440 acres of them anyway, owned free and clear, bought in pieces over 20 years of careful work and careful money. The other 240 were Dorothy Haas's ground leased, but his in the way that land becomes yours when you have worked it long enough and faithfully enough that the soil starts to know your patterns. He had been working Dorothy's ground since 1986, 18 years. She was 74 years old, living on a fixed income in a brick house in Bloomfield, and she had called him in the spring of that year because someone at her church had told her he was the kind of farmer who paid on time and left ground in good shape. Both things were true. They had shaken hands over a rent figure that was fair to both of them, and in 18 years the arrangement had never required anything more complicated than that handshake. She trusted him. He had not given her any reason not to. The pump in the cardboard box on his passenger seat was a hydraulic pump from his KIH Magnum 215. He had bought the tractor the previous spring used with 11,100 hours on it. He had paid $68,500 for it, half down, the rest financed, because he needed the horsepower for a new chisel plow setup, and because a used machine at that price was a reasonable bet if you went into it with your eyes open and maintained it correctly. Maintaining it correctly was something Gerald Voss understood at a level that went past habit into something closer to identity. He changed the hydraulic oil every 50 hours, not every 100 the way some men did not, whenever he got around to it the way other men did, but every 50 hours documented receipts, kept the specific KIH approved fluid that the manual called for, the filters changed on the same schedule. He had sent a fluid sample to a laboratory in Ames 3 weeks earlier, a fluid analysis, the kind of test that tells you exactly what is in your hydraulic system and whether anything that should not be there has gotten there. The report had come back clean. The pump had failed at 340 hours. Not a gradual failure, not the kind that gives you warning in time to plan. The kind that happens on a Tuesday morning when the loader will not lift, and the 3-point hitch will not drop, and the tractor that was supposed to be pulling a planter through your fields is instead sitting in the middle of a field at 6 in the morning doing nothing useful at all. Gerald had diagnosed it himself, which was not remarkable because Gerald diagnosed most things himself before he took them anywhere. He had the tools and the knowledge and the patience that good diagnosis requires. It was the pump. He pulled it himself. He cleaned it and examined it and found the failure. Then he called Meridian and arranged to bring it in, and he spent the 3 days before this morning assembling the folder that sat on top of the cardboard box. He had not assembled the folder out of anxiety. He was not a man who operated from anxiety. He had assembled it out of the same habit that caused him to document everything about his operation. because careful records were how a careful man proved what had happened and what had not happened, and because the pump was 340 hours old and still under warranty, and he expected this to go the way things go when a man has done his part. He expected it the way you expect the sun to come up, not with drama, just as the natural outcome of a situation whose logic was clear. The manila folder contained the following: oil change receipts for every service interval since purchase, 12 of them, each one dated, and noting the product used and the hours at time of change. Filter change records on the same schedule. The fluid analysis from Ames dated March 27th showing clean fluid with no contamination of any kind, and his own handwritten maintenance log, which he had kept from the first day he owned the machine, a record of every hour of operation and every service performed and every repair made. He finished the coffee. Nora was still upstairs. He did not wake her. He put the folder on top of the box, carried the box to the truck, and drove to Bloomfield. Now let me tell you about Gerald Voss, because to understand what happened that morning and what it cost him and what it kept costing him in the years that followed, you need to understand the kind of man who was walking through that door. Gerald was 53 years old in April of 2004. He had been farming in Davis County since 1979, when he had come back from 2 years of working construction in Des Moines with enough money for a down payment on 80 acres and enough stubbornness to make it work. He had grown the operation slowly, the way men grow things when they cannot afford to make mistakes, buying land when he could. Improving what he had, building the kind of operation that does not look impressive from the outside, because its impressiveness is in the details rather than the size. 680 acres total now, 440 owned, corn and soybeans, one full-time hired man. His wife Nora kept the books with the kind of precision that made their accountant's job simple, which was not an accident. Their 2 sons had gone to Des Moines, one in HVAC, one in electrical. They came back on weekends during planting and harvest, which mattered more than it sounded, because in an operation run tight, there were moments when 2 extra sets of hands and 2 extra hours of daylight were the difference between finishing clean and not finishing at all. He was not a flashy operator. He drove a truck that was older than it looked because he maintained it. He wore work clothes that were clean but not new. He bought used equipment when the numbers made sense and upgraded only when something had finally given everything it had. He did not borrow more than the operation could support, and he did not spend money on things that did not make the farm run better. He had been buying from Meridian Implement since 1983, 21 years. He had been buying from them not out of loyalty in the sentimental sense, but out of the practical mathematics of distance, which in farming is the same as time, which in farming is the same as money. Meridian was 11 miles from his farm. The next KIH dealer was in Centerville, 38 miles east. When something broke during planting or harvest, those extra 27 miles were not just 27 miles. They were hours. They were whether the machine got back in the field today or tomorrow. They were yield. So he stayed with Meridian the way a man stays with a doctor he does not particularly like, but whose office is on the way to work. Not because the relationship was warm, because the geography made it sensible. He pulled into the Meridian lot at 9:38. The lot was familiar to him in the way that a place you have been visiting for 2 decades becomes familiar, not noticed anymore, just present. The new tractors on the display row to the left. The service bays at the back right, 3 of the 4 doors open on that mild April morning. The parts counter inside the main building visible through the glass doors even from the parking lot. He carried the box and the folder in through the service entrance. The service desk was at the end of a short counter. Dex Rayburn was standing behind it, talking on the phone. Gerald had known Dex for most of the 11 years Dex had been at Meridian. Not known in the way you know someone you have spent time with, but known in the transactional way, the way you know the face and the name of a man you have done business with often enough that the formalities have worn smooth. Dex got off the phone and Gerald set the box on the counter and put the folder on top of it. He said, "Hydraulic pump from my 215. 340 hours. Still under warranty." He pushed the folder toward Dex. "Maintenance records are there. Fluid analysis from 3 weeks ago. Everything." Dex picked up the pump and turned it over in his hands. Gerald watched him. Dex was looking at the pump the way a man looks at something when he already knows what he is going to say about it, the kind of looking that is not really examining but performing examination. Gerald had been around enough to know the difference between a man studying a problem and a man going through the motions before delivering a conclusion that had been reached before the study began. Dex set the pump down. He said the damage was caused by contaminated fluid. Customer neglect. Not covered. Gerald stood with that for a moment. He said, "Did you test the fluid in the tractor?" Dex said, "We do not need to." Gerald said, "What contamination did you find?" Dex said, "It does not matter. The claim will not be filed." Gerald looked at the folder on the counter between them. He had spent 3 evenings putting that folder together. Not because he thought it would be dramatic or because he intended it as some kind of argument, but because it was the record of what had actually happened, and he had believed the way a man believes in things that have always been true in his experience, that what had actually happened was the relevant fact. He said, "I have got oil changes every 50 hours. KIH approved fluid. Filters on schedule. Lab analysis from Ames 3 weeks ago, clean." He paused. "That is all right there." Dex glanced at the folder. The glance lasted perhaps 2 seconds. He said the contamination must have happened after the analysis. Gerald said the pump failed 3 weeks after the analysis. At 340 hours. On a machine I bought less than a year ago. Dex said the decision has been made. Gerald said, "Can I speak with the owner?" Dex said the owner agrees with the decision. And that was the entirety of it. No teardown report showing what contamination had been found and where. No documentation of the inspection process that had led to the conclusion in under 2 minutes. No offer to run the fluid themselves and compare it against his own analysis. No second opinion. No appeal process described. No explanation of what specifically in the pump indicated contamination rather than manufacturing defect or a failure of another kind. Just a flat statement delivered with the practiced ease of a man who had said it before and expected it to close the conversation. Gerald stood at that counter for a moment with the manila folder still in his hands. He did not raise his voice. He had been raised in a household where raised voices were a sign of weakness rather than conviction, where you said what you had to say clearly, and then you stopped talking and let the facts stand on their own. He did not remind Dex Rayburn that he had been buying from Meridian since 1983. He did not remind him that Meridian was 11 miles from his farm, and that he had stayed with them through 21 years of smaller dealers and sometimes better prices elsewhere precisely because distance mattered and relationships were supposed to mean something. He did not say any of that. He nodded once. He picked up the folder. He walked out. Have you ever stood in front of someone with the facts in your hand, with the documentation and the records and the evidence that proved you had done everything right and understood in the space of a single moment that none of it was going to matter, that the decision had already been made and the facts you were presenting were not going to change it because the decision had never been about the facts? That is what Gerald Voss walked out a Meridian implement with on the morning of April 17th, 2004. Not just a denied warranty claim. The specific knowledge that the deal he had believed in, the deal where careful men who kept their records and maintained their equipment and treated people straight would eventually be treated the same way in return, that deal was not real. Not at that service counter, not with that man behind it. He drove home. He did not tell Nora right away. He went out to the shop and stood there for a while with the pump in the box on his workbench and thought through the situation the way he thought through all situations, practically without drama, looking for the path that kept the farm moving. The tractor needed to be fixed. The spring field work was already underway. He did not have the luxury of waiting for an argument to resolve itself over the course of weeks. He needed the machine back in the field. He ordered the replacement pump himself. He paid for it himself. He installed it himself in his own shop over 2 days, working evenings and the early morning hours before the day's other work began. The bill came to $4,100. It was not a catastrophic number in isolation, but it was not an isolated number. It was a number that sat inside a system of other numbers: seed costs and diesel costs and equipment note payments and land rent and the hired man's wages and all the other moving pieces of an operation that ran on margins that were real but not generous. There were years when $4,000 was painful. There were years when it was the difference between finishing even and falling behind just enough for something else to give way. Gerald knew which kind of year 2004 was going to be. He knew it the way farmers know things about their seasons, not because they can see the future, but because they know the terrain they are moving through and they know where the ground gets soft. He got the tractor back into the field on May 3rd. Most of his neighbors had finished planting by April 28th. He did not complain about that. He did not sit at the coffee counter at the co-op and tell the story to whoever would listen. He adjusted. He absorbed the delay and kept moving and told himself that a 2-week setback was something a careful operation could work around, which was true, and that the season was still in front of him, which was also true, and that the work itself would square the accounts the way work always had, which he believed as surely as he believed anything. 3 days after he got the tractor back in the field, Meridian called. The service manager said they had reconsidered. They would split the cost with him 50-50. A compromise, he called it. Reasonable. Gerald thought about the word reasonable for a moment. He thought about what reasonable meant in the context of a pump that had failed at 340 hours on a machine he had maintained to the letter and beyond. He thought about the folder sitting on his workbench, the 12 oil change receipts, and the filter records, and the fluid analysis from Ames that showed clean fluid. He said no. He said it without anger and without explanation, just no. The service manager seemed surprised. He started to say something about the cost sharing being an unusual offer. Gerald thanked him for calling. He hung up the phone. Nora was in the kitchen doorway. She had heard the exchange. She did not ask him to explain. She understood the explanation without needing it said because she had been keeping the books on this operation for 23 years, and she understood the numbers, and she understood her husband, and she knew that the word no in that phone call was not about money. By then it was no longer about money. By then it was about something harder to name and harder to let go of, the specific injury that comes when you have held up your end of an arrangement in good faith for a long time and discovered that the other party had never quite been holding up theirs. The arrangement was not written down anywhere. It was the old deal, the one that said a man who kept his records and did his maintenance and treated people straight would be treated the same way when it was his turn to need something. Gerald had believed in that deal the way he believed in most things that had always been true in his experience. He had not thought about it much because he had not needed to think about it. It had simply operated in the background of how he conducted himself, a quiet assumption about the nature of the relationship between a customer and a dealer he had done business with for 21 years. What he learned on April 17th was that the assumption had a limit he had not known about. He went back to work. Now let me tell you about Dorothy Haas, because Dorothy is part of this story, and the part she plays requires that you understand who she was before June of 2004. Dorothy had been a school teacher, 40 years in the Davis County system, elementary and middle school, both teaching reading and arithmetic to children who in some cases went on to teach the same things to their own children. She had retired in 1990 with a pension that was adequate and a house that was paid for and a piece of ground that her husband Harold had bought in 1971 as an investment and that had passed to her when Harold died in 1988. 240 acres of bottomland on the south edge of the county. She did not farm it herself and had never intended to. She rented it to the man her church friend had recommended, a farmer named Gerald Voss, who paid on time and left the ground in good shape, and she had been doing that for 18 years by the spring of 2004. She called him every spring to confirm the arrangement, and he always confirmed it. The number had gone up a few dollars an acre over the years as land values shifted. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that felt like a renegotiation so much as an acknowledgement of reality. They were both practical people, and they had built something practical together, which in Davis County passed for a relationship. She was 74 years old in 2004, and she lived on her pension and Harold's Social Security benefits and the rent checks that came from Gerald Voss twice a year, spring and fall. It was enough to live on if she was careful. She was careful. She had been careful her whole life. Gerald knew all of this. He had known it for 18 years. He had factored it into every decision he made about her ground, knowing that the woman on the other end of the arrangement was not a landowner with room to absorb uncertainty, but a retired school teacher on a fixed income, for whom the rent checks mattered, in the way that fixed income money always matters, specifically and without a safety net. He had never been late with a payment, not once in 18 years. He had treated her ground the way a man treats ground he intends to still be farming in 20 years, because he did intend that, and because he understood that how you treated the ground was how you treated the person who trusted you with it. That was the arrangement. That was what 18 years had built. In June of 2004, Dorothy Haas called him. He was in the shop when the phone rang. He had spent the morning replacing a belt on the planter and was going over the machine, checking for anything else that needed attention before the next pass. It was the kind of work he did alone, methodical, unhurried, his mind running the way it ran when his hands were occupied through the season's numbers. The soil moisture reports the diesel prices that had been climbing since January. He picked up the shop phone. Dorothy said she hoped she was not catching him at a bad time. He said she was not. She said she needed to talk to him about the ground. He knew what was coming before she finished the sentence. Not specifically, not the exact number, but the shape of it. He had been farming long enough to know what certain phone calls contained before they delivered their contents. She said her nephew had come to see her. He farmed 1,800 acres in the northern part of the county, a large operation, and he had approached her about the 240. He had offered her $20 an acre, more than Gerald was paying. She told Gerald she wanted him to know first. She said if he could match the offer, the land was his. She liked him. She trusted him. She had trusted him for 18 years. Gerald did the math while she was still talking. $20 an acre, 240 acres, $4,800 a year. He stood in the shop with the phone against his ear and thought about the number. He thought about it in the context of the spring that had already happened, the pump that had failed at 340 hours, the $4,100 he had paid out of his own pocket for a repair he should not have had to pay for. He thought about the margin that was available to him in this operation in this year and what the two numbers together meant. He knew the answer before he finished thinking the question. He said, "I understand, Dorothy." Before she could say anything more, he said, "I hope your nephew does well with that ground." He meant it. He was not a man who said things he did not mean. She said she was sorry. She had been wrestling with it, she said. She wanted him to know that. He said he appreciated her calling him directly. He said that is the right thing to do. She said she knew how much the ground meant to him. He said it was all right. He said he understood. The lease ended that fall. Gerald put the phone back on its hook and stood in the shop for a moment. The belt he had been replacing was still on the workbench, half installed. The planter sat where he had left it. He thought about $4,100. He thought about $4,800. He thought about the shape of a single season and how far damage could travel when the margins were already thin, and then someone took another 4,000 out of them from a direction you had not anticipated. He went back to work on the belt. There was not much else to do. That evening at dinner, he told Nora. She listened without interrupting. When he was done, she said, "How short are we?" He told her the numbers. She was quiet for a while. She was the one who kept the books. She knew the numbers as well as he did, maybe better because she saw them in the aggregate, the way the person keeping the books always does, the whole picture at once, not just the individual pieces. She understood exactly what losing 240 acres meant to the operation, not just in rent revenue, but in equipment efficiency and cost per acre, and the way that fewer acres meant every fixed cost got distributed across a smaller base. She said, "We will figure it out." He believed her. He always believed her when she said that because it had always been true and because she was the kind of woman who did not say things she did not have evidence for. They would figure it out. They would scale back and tighten and adjust the way they had adjusted before and the way they would adjust again because that was what the life required and they had chosen the life. He did not tell many people about it. Not because he was ashamed exactly, though there was something in the neighborhood of ashamed. Mostly he did not tell people because he did not see the use. The ground was gone. Talking about it would not bring it back. He was not a man who collected sympathy or who believed that telling a hard story made the hard story easier to carry. He just adjusted. He sold the chisel plow he had bought the Magnum 215 to pull because without the 240 there was less ground to work, and a chisel plow of that size did not make sense for the acreage he was left with. He reduced his seed and chemical orders accordingly. He shrank the operation down to the acres he could still hold and still make work. He kept going. That was his answer to most things. When something broke, you fixed it. When the margins got tight, you cut somewhere else. When a season went wrong, you finished it and started thinking about the next one. He did not believe in complaining because he did not believe complaining changed anything. He believed work changed things. He had believed that his whole life, and it had been true enough times that the belief had never quite been tested to its limit. He did not know yet that the test was coming. He only knew that the spring had been harder than it should have been, and that the summer was going to require adjusting to a smaller operation than he had planned on, and that the fall would come, the way fall always came, regardless of what a man wished had gone differently. He kept the Magnum 215, the tractor with the new pump, the tractor he had paid $4,100 to repair out of his own pocket. He kept it because it was still the machine he needed for the work that remained, and because selling it would have cost him more in replaced capacity than it saved, and because he was not in the habit of getting rid of things that could still do the job simply because the job had become harder to justify. He kept it and he used it and he maintained it the way he maintained everything carefully and on schedule because that was who he was, and who you are does not change because one season went wrong. What he did not know, what he had no way of knowing from inside the particular silence he had chosen to keep about what had happened, was that he was not the only man in Davis County who had walked out of Meridian that spring carrying something like what he was carrying. He was not the only one with a story that had no good ending and a record that had not been enough. He was not the only one standing in a field in May with a bill paid and a grievance stored, and a season that was going to require more from him than the season should have required. He was not the only one, but he did not know that yet, and the men who were like him did not know about each other yet either. They each believed the way quiet men believe in private losses, that what had happened to them was theirs alone to carry. That was the spring of 2004, and the summer that followed was going to start teaching a few of them that they had been wrong about that. Thad Finch farmed 520 acres about 12 miles south of Gerald Voss, and he had been buying from Meridian Implement since 1991. He was not close friends with Gerald. They were the kind of men who knew each other the way farmers in the same county know each other well enough to talk equipment and weather and yields when they cross paths at the elevator or the co-op well enough to trust the other man's word on a piece of ground or a piece of equipment. Not so close that they called each other on the phone or showed up at each other's places uninvited. In a rural county, that kind of relationship covers most of the people you actually depend on. Thad had a KIH Magnum 245 and a 2388 combine. He had been running KIH equipment for 13 years because he had started with it and it had worked, and because Meridian was close, and because changing brands means learning a new set of habits and a new parts inventory. And there is a cost to that which does not always show up in the purchase price, but shows up reliably in the first 2 or 3 years after the switch. He had been in the dealership on April 16th, the day before Gerald brought in the pump. He had come in for filters and a couple of hydraulic fittings, and had seen Gerald's Magnum 215 on the shop floor through the open bay door. He had asked one of the parts men what was wrong with it. The answer was simple enough: hydraulic pump failure, probably warranty, nothing unusual. Equipment breaks, claims get filed, machines get fixed. That was how it was supposed to work, and how it had always worked in Thad's experience. So he filed the information away as unremarkable, and finished picking up his filters and drove home. A week later he was back for something else, and he asked the parts man if Gerald's tractor was done yet. The parts man said yes, but the warranty had not covered it. Customer neglect, the service manager had decided. Gerald had paid the bill himself. Thad did not say much. He was not the type to stand at a parts counter making speeches. He thanked the man and picked up what he had come for and went back to his truck. But the thing stuck with him the way things stick when they do not line up right. He knew Gerald Voss, not intimately but well enough. He knew that Gerald was not the kind of operator who beat on equipment and then expected the dealer to cover the damage. Gerald was the kind of operator who kept records, who maintained things on schedule, who did his own diagnostics before he brought anything in because that was who he was, because that kind of attention was part of how the man moved through his work and through his life. If a man like Gerald could walk in with records and receipts and a clean fluid analysis and still get denied without a serious look, then something had changed. Or something about Meridian's service desk had always been a certain way, and Thad had not been close enough to the edge of it to notice until now. He thought about that off and on through the spring. He did not call Gerald, he did not ask around, he just thought about it the way you think about something that does not resolve cleanly, that keeps coming back when you are doing other things, that sits in the part of your mind where you keep examples of who can still be trusted when something expensive goes wrong. Then in August his combine threw a bearing in the feeder house. It was not a small repair, not the kind of thing you diagnose and fix in a morning. The feeder house bearing failure had a particular sound and a particular consequence, and by the time Thad had the machine stopped and was looking at what had happened, he already knew it was going to cost him time and money he had not budgeted for. Parts and labor were going to run close to $3,200. The machine had 940 hours on it and was still under warranty. He called Meridian. They sent a technician out the next day. The technician looked it over, made notes, told Thad he would file the claim. Standard procedure. Thad went back to cutting. 2 days later, Dex Rayburn called. The feeder house bearing failure, Dex said, had been caused by improper tensioning on the chain. Not covered. Thad asked how they had determined that. Dex said the technician had documented it. Thad asked to see the documentation. Dex said it was internal. Thad had been running KIH equipment for 13 years. He knew how to tension a feeder house chain. He had set that machine up himself at the start of the season and had followed the service manual exactly because he had the manual, and he had read it and he had done what it said because that was how you started a season with the machine you were about to put through a harvest. He said so. Dex did not move. The decision was final. Thad wrote the check. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten anyone. He did not tell Dex Rayburn that he had been buying from Meridian since 1991, or that a combine in harvest season does not have the luxury of sitting still while a man makes a philosophical point about warranty coverage. He just wrote the check and got the machine back in the field and kept cutting because the crop does not care who was right and the calendar does not wait for anyone. But while he was writing the check, he was also thinking. He was thinking about Gerald Voss and the hydraulic pump. He was thinking about the specifics of what he had heard in April, the clean fluid analysis, the documentation that had been dismissed in under 2 minutes, the decision that had been reached before the question was finished. He was thinking about his own situation now, the technician who had been out to his farm, the documentation that was apparently internal and therefore not available to the man who was being asked to pay. Based on it, the conclusion that had arrived with the same practiced flatness that Gerald had described. Same dealership, same service manager, same pattern. A single case can be a bad day. 2 cases that look identical in their structure start to become something else. Thad paid the bill and went back to work and did not say anything to anyone for about a week. Then he drove over to Gerald's place on a Tuesday evening. Gerald was in the shop when Thad pulled in. He looked up from what he was doing, recognized the truck, and waited. Thad came in and they stood in the shop for a few minutes talking about harvest, about the weather, about the condition of Thad's combine after the bearing failure. The conversation had the normal shape of two men who know each other checking in. Then Thad said, "I heard what happened with your pump in the spring." Gerald kept working on what he was working on. "Thad said I had a warranty claim denied in August. Feeder house bearing, 940 hours. They said I tensioned the chain wrong. I set that machine up to the manual." Gerald looked at him. Thad said, "Same service manager." Same kind of answer. "I was wondering if you had heard anything about other people having the same problem." Gerald was quiet for a moment. He set down the tool he was holding. He looked at Thad in the way a man looks when he is deciding how to say something that is not simple. He said, "I appreciate you coming out here, Thad." He said, "But I am not a man who goes around telling that story." Thad looked at him. Gerald said, "I paid the bill. I am past it. I have got other things to work on." There was a silence between them that was not unfriendly but was not comfortable either. Thad understood what Gerald was saying. He understood the philosophy behind it, the belief that work was the answer to most things, and that complaining was not. He had lived by versions of that same belief himself. Most of the men he knew had. He said, "All right, I understand that." He paused. "But I am going to ask around a little. I just want to know if this is a pattern or if it is the two of us having a bad year." Gerald said, "That is your call to make." Thad nodded. He said good night and drove home. Gerald stood in the shop for a while after Thad's taillights disappeared down the road. He thought about the conversation the way he thought about things that required more than a quick pass-through. He thought about whether he had made the right call in what he had said. He had meant it. He was not a man who went around with a grievance looking for an audience. He believed in absorbing what happened to you and adjusting and moving forward. He had done that. He was doing it. But there was a thing underneath that belief that the conversation with Thad had touched in a way he had not fully anticipated. The thing was not whether he should have spoken up. He had made his peace with that decision. The thing was smaller and harder to name. It was the specific feeling of understanding when you heard a second story that matched your own story, that what you had absorbed as yours alone to carry was not quite as alone as you had thought. He went back to work. He did not call Thad. He did not ask what Thad found out. He had said what he had said, and he meant it, and he was going to continue meaning it because changing course now would only mean he had not meant it in the first place, and Gerald Voss meant what he said. But Thad kept asking. He was not loud about it. He was not the kind of man who announced that he was investigating something. He was just a farmer in Davis County who talked to other farmers the way farmers talk in the natural flow of conversations that happened at the parts counter and at the sale barn and after church and at the elevator and in 5-minute exchanges in parking lots when two men who knew each other happened to be in the same place. He started raising the subject when the chance came up naturally, and paying attention to the answers. What he found surprised him by how quickly it accumulated. The first man he talked to was a farmer named Burl Eckstein, who had an operation about 8 miles northeast of Bloomfield and had been buying from Meridian since the mid-90s. Burl had a story from the previous spring, a PTO shaft failure on a Magnum 180 denied on the grounds of improper hookup. Burl had been hooking up PTO shafts for 30 years without incident, and the explanation had not satisfied him, but he had paid the bill and gone back to work, and had not told many people about it because that was how men like Burl handled things. The second man was a farmer named Roy Spicer who had a transmission issue on an MX-21. Oh, that had been denied because the hydraulic reservoir was supposedly overfilled, even though Meridian's own service department had serviced the machine 2 months before the failure and had checked the fluid levels at that time. Roy had pointed this out. Dex Rayburn had told him the machine must have been operated in a way that caused fluid expansion after the service. Roy had not been able to get any documentation of how this had been determined. The third man Thad talked to had a combine concave issue on a 2366 that had been denied as foreign material damage, even though the only thing that had gone through that combine was corn. The foreign material theory was never explained specifically. The customer paid. By October of 2004, Thad had spoken to 6 farmers with recent stories about warranty claims denied by Meridian. 3 of the 6 had claims that had been denied in the same calendar year. Each story had a different machine, a different failure, a different specific explanation. But when you laid the stories next to each other, the structure underneath them was the same every time. The failure happened. Meridian inspected it. Meridian decided quickly, usually within a day or two of the inspection, that the cause was customer error of some kind. The explanation was broad enough to be hard to disprove in the moment and vague enough to be useless as a basis for appeal. The claim was either not filed or filed and denied without meaningful documentation shared with the customer. The customer was told the decision was final. The customer either paid or sat still with broken equipment in the middle of a season that did not care who was right. Most of them paid. Have you ever been in a situation where you realized that what you thought was your bad luck was actually a pattern, and that the reason you did not see it earlier was that everyone else was also keeping quiet about it, was also absorbing their piece of it alone, was also telling themselves that complaining would not change anything, and that work was the better answer? That specific recognition, the moment when the private thing becomes a shared thing, has a quality to it that is hard to describe. It is not exactly relief. It is something more complicated than relief. It is the particular feeling of understanding that you have been carrying something that was heavier than it should have been precisely because you were carrying it alone. Drop a comment and tell me if you have been in that place, because I think more people have been there than have ever said so. Thad was not looking for relief. He was not assembling a grievance. He was trying to answer a practical question, which was whether what had happened to him and to Gerald was isolated or systemic, and whether knowing the answer to that question changed anything about how a man should conduct his business. By the time he had 6 stories, he had the beginning of an answer. He started keeping a list, not because he had some clear plan for what to do with it. Mostly because once he understood that this was not random, he wanted to know how big it actually was. He wrote down names, machines, the failure that had been presented for warranty consideration, the reason that had been given for denial, whether any documentation of the inspection had been shared with the customer, whether Meridian had offered anything like cost sharing or a second opinion or any kind of formal appeal process. The answer to the last 3 questions was almost always the same. No documentation shared, no cost sharing offered in most cases, no appeal process described. The list grew faster than he had expected. Once a few men understood they were not alone, they talked a little easier. Not a lot easier, just enough. In a rural county where people do business face to face and remember things longer than they say, that little bit easier was sufficient. By January of 2005, the list had 14 names. And then Carl Denner bought a tractor. Carl farmed in the southern part of the county about 20 miles from Gerald's place, and he had been looking for a larger tractor than what he had. In January of 2005, he purchased a used KIH Magnum 275 from Meridian Implement. The machine had 1,400 hours on it. He paid $81,000 for it. The dealership included a 90-day powertrain warranty, which was standard for used machines sold through the dealership. Carl had done his due diligence. He had looked the machine over carefully and asked the right questions, and felt that the price was fair for what he was getting. He had financed it through his regular ag lender, and had the machine in his yard by the middle of January, ready for the spring field work that was still 2 months away. In March, during the spring field preparations that preceded planting, the tractor's rear differential started making noise. A grinding sound under load, the specific kind of sound that tells any experienced operator that something inside a differential is doing something it should not be doing. Carl brought the machine back to Meridian on March 18th. He had owned it for about 60 days. He was still inside the 90-day warranty window. Dex Rayburn looked at the differential and said the damage had been caused by running the tractor in the wrong gear range. Carl had been operating it outside the recommended RPM range for the load, Dex said. Modern tractors required more precision than older machines, and the tolerances were tighter. Carl asked what that meant exactly. Dex said he had been putting too much load on the drivetrain at the wrong engine speed. Carl had been farming for 40 years. He had operated more tractors than he could count. He knew where a tractor should pull and where it should not. He knew how to read a tachometer, and he knew the difference between lugging an engine and working it in its proper range. He said he had been using the machine the same way he had used every tractor he had ever owned, watching the tatch shifting, when it made sense, keeping the engine where it belonged. Dex said that was not good enough anymore. Carl asked if they could prove he had operated it incorrectly. Dex said the damage itself is proof. The repair cost $7,800. Carl paid it. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten anyone. He did not tell Dex that he had just bought the machine 60 days ago, and that $7,800 on top of $81,000 was a particular kind of cruelty that did not require any special expertise to recognize. He just paid it because the spring planting window was 2 weeks away and he needed the tractor in the field, and because standing on principle in March when your equipment is down is a luxury that the farming calendar does not provide. Then he called Thad Finch. That call mattered in a way that was different from the conversations that had come before it. Those conversations had been about men comparing notes after the fact, men who had each carried their stories privately for months before beginning to talk. This was different. This was a man calling the day after he had paid the bill, while the anger was still fresh and the specific details were still precisely sharp in his memory. And what he described to Thad matched the structure of every other story on the list, so exactly that Thad stopped taking notes halfway through because he already knew how the story was going to end. The failure had happened within the warranty period. Meridian had inspected it. Meridian had decided quickly and internally that the customer was responsible. The explanation had come in language that was broad enough to cover almost anything and specific enough to sound technical, but too vague to be challenged with any precision. No documentation of the internal determination had been shared. No formal appeal had been offered. The customer had paid. Same structure. Every time. Thad hung up the phone and looked at his list. 14 names before Carl Denner. Now 15. And the 15 was cleaner than most of the others because the machine was 60 days old and still inside the stated warranty window, and the customer had kept records and knew his equipment, and there was still no documentation and still no appeal, and still the same answer delivered with the same practice flatness. Thad understood something that afternoon that he had been approaching for several months, but had not quite arrived at until that phone call. This was not a series of individual bad decisions by a service manager having a bad stretch. This was a way of doing business. Not called that, not written down anywhere as policy, but consistent enough across enough cases and enough machines and enough customers to have stopped being coincidence somewhere around the 6th or 7th name on the list. It was a system, and the system had a logic to it that was not hard to understand once you saw it clearly. When a warranty claim got filed and approved, the dealership absorbed the cost, the labor, the parts, the time. That had a number attached to it. When a warranty claim got denied, the customer absorbed the cost. The customer paid, or the customer sat still with broken equipment in the middle of a season, and most customers paid because the season did not wait. That also had a number attached to it. The system put the cost on the side of the counter that had the least leverage to resist it. The customers who had broken equipment in March or August or October, customers whose planting or harvest depended on getting the machine fixed and getting it fixed, now those customers were not in a position to fight. They could be right and still lose by waiting, and most of them did not fight. Most of them paid and went back to work and carried the grievance in the private way that quiet men carry things. Thad was beginning to understand that Dex Rayburn had been counting on exactly that. The silence was not incidental. The silence was the mechanism. He drove to Centerville in October of 2005 to meet with the KIH dealer there. Heartland equipment was smaller than Meridian 3 service bays. Instead of 6 fewer tractors on the lot, less of a footprint in every visible way. If a man were judging dealerships by what he could see from the parking lot, Meridian would still have looked like the stronger operation. Thad was not judging by parking lots. He asked to speak with the service manager. A man named Ed Calloway came out, a man who had been at Heartland since 1981. And who had the kind of presence that comes from spending 24 years in the same building doing the same work and caring about whether the work was done right. Ed shook his hand and they sat down in the service office. Thad did not flatter anyone. He asked directly whether Heartland would take on customers from Davis County, which was outside their primary service area. Ed said they would take on anyone who wanted honest service. Then Thad asked the question that actually mattered. He asked how Heartland handled warranty claims. Ed did not give him a sales pitch. He did not describe a formal process with numbered steps and promised turnaround times. He told him plainly, if a claim looked legitimate, they filed it. If KIH denied it at the corporate level, they appealed the denial. If the appeal also failed, they worked with the customer on cost sharing, but they did not deny claims themselves, just to avoid the paperwork or the cost. They did not make internal decisions about customer fault, and then present those decisions to the customer as settled fact without documentation. He said we figure that a warranty claim is not just about one repair. It is about whether a customer believes that if he comes to us, he will be treated fairly when he has the least leverage. If a man cannot trust us when his equipment is down, he is not really our customer. He is just someone who has not found a better option yet. Thad looked at Ed Calloway for a moment. He said, "That sounds like the way it ought to work." Ed said, "It is the only way that makes sense to me." Thad thanked him and drove home. Over the next 3 weeks, he made 16 phone calls. He did not call everyone on the list. Some of the men were too far into existing relationships with equipment financing to make a switch practical in the near term. Some were close to retirement and had decided that whatever frustrations they had with Meridian were not worth the disruption of changing dealers in the last few years of an operation. Some still hoped that the problem would resolve itself, that Meridian would see what was happening and change course, that the pattern would turn out to be temporary. Thad was not trying to organize a boycott. He was not leading anything. He was trying to answer a practical question for the men he talked to, which was whether there was a reliable alternative and whether the alternative was worth the inconvenience of the extra miles. The answer from most of the men who had specific reasons to consider it came back the same way, carefully, quietly, with the kind of tired certainty you hear when people have already been thinking the same thing on their own and are simply ready to act on it. They would finish the current season with what they had. Through the winter and into the following spring they would move. Some through auction, some through private sale, some by simply taking their parts and service business to Heartland and their next equipment purchase elsewhere. They would not make a public issue of it. They would not call the newspaper or write letters or show up at the dealership to deliver speeches. They would just stop. That decision mattered because of how plain it was. There was no theater in it. No one was trying to punish Meridian in some dramatic way. They were doing what customers do when a business has made itself unsafe to trust. They were leaving. By November of 2005, Thad's list had 19 names on it. Not all 19 were ready to move immediately. Some could not. Some had logistics to work out equipment notes with the dealership service appointments, already scheduled parts on order. In farming, you do not always get to time your exits to your preferences, but 14 of the 19 were prepared to move their business as soon as they could arrange it. 14 men who had been repeat customers of Meridian Implement, men who had been buying equipment and parts and service from that building in Bloomfield for years, had reached the same conclusion independently and were going to act on it. Thad did not think of himself as having organized anything. But in the loose way of rural communities where nothing is formally announced and everything still spreads, he had held together a shared decision that most of the men involved would not have coordinated on their own. The list had done one other thing that Thad had not fully anticipated when he started it. It had changed how the men on it thought about their own situations. Each of them had arrived at his particular loss, believing it was his alone, a private injury to be absorbed and worked around and not spoken of much. Some of them had half blamed themselves, had wondered, in the quiet moments, whether there was something they had done differently that might have produced a different result. The private loss carries a weight of self-doubt that the shared loss does not carry, because the shared loss makes clear that the pattern was never about any individual man's equipment or any individual man's maintenance practices. When men who had carried that private weight for months understood that 14 other men in the same county had the same story from the same service desk, the weight shifted, not gone, but different. The specific injury of being told you caused your own breakdown when you had not caused your own breakdown looks different when you see it applied identically to the man next to you and the man next to him. Thad understood that even if he never put it in those terms, he just knew what he had heard and he knew what it meant. The problem was not that a few careless farmers had angry feelings about denied claims. The problem was that Meridian Implement had built a way of handling warranty issues that concentrated all the power on one side of the counter and all the cost on the other, and had relied on the silence of customers who were too practical to fight back during a season to keep that arrangement from becoming visible. It had become visible. 14 men in Davis County had made their decision, and the men at Meridian, still behind their counter, still processing work orders and answering phones and doing the visible work of running a dealership, still did not know. That was the thing about the kind of leaving that was coming. It did not arrive with any noise they could hear from inside the building. It arrived as absence. Fewer trucks in the lot, fewer names on work orders, fewer trade-ins coming through the fall cycle. A gradual thinning of the customer base that would look from inside like a slow market and not like a verdict. It would take a while for them to understand the difference. Gerald Voss was not in any of those 16 phone calls. He did not know the list existed. He had said what he had said to Thad on that Tuesday evening in his shop, that he was not a man who went around telling that story, and he had meant it and he had kept it. He kept his head down and did the work and adjusted the operation to the smaller shape it had taken, and did not ask Thad what he had found out. But his story was still there at the center of what Thad had put together, whether Gerald knew it or not, and whether Gerald wanted it or not. In most communities, the first man treated unfairly gets forgotten once bigger stories come along. In this one, Gerald remained the measure against which others had calibrated their own risk. Men kept asking versions of the same question when they heard what had happened to him. If they did that to Gerald Voss, what will they do to me when something expensive breaks? That question was not rhetorical. It was practical. It was the question that 14 men had answered by the time Thad finished his phone calls in November of 2005. And the answer they had given was not loud and not dramatic. It was the only answer that mattered. In the end, the answer that is written not in words, but in where a man takes his business when he has a choice. They were going to Centerville. And Gerald Voss, farming his 440 acres alone, keeping his records and maintaining his equipment and trusting that the work would be enough, did not know yet that what had happened to him in April of 2004 had already done more than cost him $4,100 in 2 weeks and 240 acres of rented ground. It had become the example that 14 men in his county had used to decide they were not willing to wait and find out what it would cost them. That was the thing about being the first. You absorb the cost alone, but the lesson belongs to everyone who comes after.